All right, we're going to give people a minute or two to sort of filter in, but want to start by thanking you all for being here and thanking our guest, Skip Mark, or Dr. Skip Mark, for coming down from the University of Rhode Island, where he is the director for the Center of Nonviolence and Peace Studies. This is part of an event that was generously funded by community engagement funds through UMSL. It's co-sponsored by UMSL Global and UMSL Political Science Academy and the Department of Political Science. So thank all of them for their support. And get rid of this also. So today we're going to be continuing our series on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at 75, and we're going to be talking about specifically worker rights and labor rights, the causes of respect and violations of those, and then some of the consequences as well. Skip is also the co-director of the Seer Rights Data Project. If you haven't noticed, I bring in speakers that have a very heavy data focus because human rights data is really powerful. The predecessor to the Seer Rights Data Project was the CIRI Data Project, CIRI, and it was cited by the World Bank. It was cited by high-level diplomats from Mexico, who wanted to improve their score on not basically torturing and killing people. I know Skip has heard this anecdote before too. Basically, it ranges from 0 to 8, and they wanted to improve their score to where they were only torturing some people. And this was part of like their long-term administrative goal. And that to me is bizarre. Like you would admit that you only want to go from really bad to like kind of bad. But yeah, so data gets noticed, it gets used by advocates, by governments, by nonprofits and intergovernmental organizations. So I think grounding what we're talking about with how relevant the Universal Declaration of Human Rights continues to be in good data is really important. So Skip is going to talk about labor rights today, both in the US and abroad. I'm going to turn it over to him and let him have the floor. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Stephen, for inviting me. And thank you, UMSL, for the invitation. I'm really excited to be here. It's my first time in St. Louis, so it's nice to get to visit a new city and a pretty cool one. I'm going to talk a little bit today about worker rights. And I study human rights measurement, development policy, and conflict. And I'm really interested in sort of how all three of those relate to each other. So one of the really interesting things about human rights is that when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being drafted and debated, worker rights and everything in it was up for grabs, right? Here's a quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a huge proponent of including worker rights and specifically the right to unionize in the UDHR. And here's a quote for her sort of advocating for why the right to unionize needed its own specific article, as opposed to just saying all workers should be treated fairly, right? And what she says is the right to form and join trade unions was an essential freedom. And she goes on to say the struggle was in fact still continuing, and that the US actually has a very bloody and contentious history around labor movements in the US. Prior to the UDHR and some of the legislation that came about in the 20th century, we had massive killings of labor organizers, right? So we're not just talking about, do you have a decent job? We're also talking about, is the state, our businesses, our militia groups killing people who are trying to advocate for better wages? So in the UDHR, right, labor rights are specifically covered under Article 23 and 24. So the right to work is the language in the UDHR. In the US, that language has been co-opted to essentially mean an attack. We should get rid of labor unions. And I think that's intentional, right? And it's one of the things that when human rights scholars are talking about the US, they have to be a little bit careful. Maybe talk about the right to employment. But your choice of where you work, just in favorable conditions, unemployment protections, non-discrimination in hiring, promotion, firing, equal pay for equal work, favorable remuneration, the right to form and join trade unions, limits on working hours, and holidays with pay, right? So these are a lot of rights that I think most workers in the US and around the world would say are essential to living a life of dignity. And really the worker rights are necessary to protect a whole bunch of other human rights. It's really hard to argue that you can get a good education, you can have time for your family and your children, that you can be an informed voter if you are working 2 jobs and you're overworked and underpaid and stressed. So we go from the UDHR, right, which starts by saying, here are all of the things that states should do, right? There's sort of an affirmation. All countries around the world somehow agree that they have an obligation to give all these things to their citizens. Now, if we were to scrap the UDHR and try and start again today, it would be far less progressive, right? The human rights regime and the documents, the Universal Bill of Human Rights, really come out of World War II and are only possible because we essentially saw the violation of rights threaten to destroy democracy, lead to mass killings. And so this becomes sort of a bulwark against World War III. And so we go from the UDHR to the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which outlines all of the things in the UDHR and adds more rights, right? We get paid maternity leave, we get the right to strike, we get equal opportunities. And more recently, we have the ILO Declaration on the Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work in 1998. And at that point, they're focusing on 5 different types of worker rights. Non-discrimination based on race, class, gender, sexuality, getting rid of child labor, getting rid of forced labor, the right to unionize, and the right to bargain collectively. So in the scholarly literature, we define worker rights as rights that apply to anyone with a desire to work in a job that pays well, is fulfilling, dignified, and provides a feeling of societal contribution. So this is not just anyone who wants to work, right? This says, this needs to be a meaningful job. It not only has to pay well and treat you well, it also has to be one that gives your life meaning, that you can feel like you contributed to something. And worker rights are a little weird, right? If we're talking about repression or the right to vote, these are things that governments give you or they refrain from doing to you. But worker rights are a right where the government is really mediating this employer-employee relationship, right? So we have employer, employee, and the government. And sometimes the government is just a referee in the private sector, and sometimes they are both an employer and a referee. And that can lead to some conflicts of interest. Worker rights are ones where, even if they are not respected now, international law isn't saying you have to do everything all at once. What it's really saying is over time, these rights should get better. We shouldn't see backsliding. We should see governments using all resources they have available to them to ensure that worker rights are improving. So the basic question, one important question to think about is who is a worker? This is sort of a definition taken from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Basically say labor is made up of those who receive a wage from an employer, right? If the bulk of your income comes from a wage you receive, you can be fired, you're considered labor. If the bulk of your income comes from owning things like factories, stocks, land, your capital, right? And obviously it's a little bit more complicated than that, right? So we have subcontractors who tend to be excluded from labor protections in the US. So if you are a FedEx driver who is unionized, you're a worker. If you're a FedEx driver who's subcontracted out, you are not covered by labor protections, even though I think most of us would consider that to be a worker. We also now have sort of the rise of people who own their own means of production, right? You produce art, you produce your own commodities and you sell them online on Etsy, or you set up your own shop at a local market. And so we are seeing this blurring of the lines between who is a worker and who isn't a worker. And often this blurring has a lot to do with whether labor rights laws in the US or worker rights around the world. So that's sort of how I kind of distinguish that. We talk about labor rights in the US and worker rights globally. Who is covered by these rights? So I am a co-director of the Sea Rights Data Project. We look at a bunch of human rights around the world. The ones I'm going to talk about today are here: the right to unionize, bargain collectively, strike, child labor, forced labor, safe working conditions, limitation on work hours, an adequate minimum wage, and human trafficking, which we consider to be a labor rights violation, but it also violates a whole bunch of other rights. We look at US State Department reports on human rights and US trafficking in person reports, and we turn the text that describes what these rights look like around the world into numbers. Right? We say a 0 means that this right is violated in widespread violations. A 1 means there are some violations, and a 2 means it's respected, or at least we don't have evidence that it's violated. And one of the reasons we don't use a more complicated metric is because, well, both firms and governments are pretty good at hiding what they do or justifying it. We think there's a lot of error in what we can witness and which human rights violations we can see, document, and make allegations that are credible, and which ones we're unable to, right? So in the US, if you have a firm that busts a union, can you prove that they were union busting? Or were they just giving workers an opportunity not to unionize, right? And a lot of this gets caught up in legislation. A lot of this gets caught up in the courts. And so, you know, we think this coding scheme is a good way of capturing overall trends around the world. So if we have data on what human rights look like around the world, one question we might ask is, are worker rights improving or declining? So this is just a global average. We standardize the score. So if you hit 100, that means you have the highest score you can. If you hit a 0, you have the lowest score. And this is for all countries around the world, about 196 countries in our sample, from 1995 to 2019. And one of the things we notice is that for a lot of these rights, in practice, they're declining. So the right to unionize and bargain collectively, practices go from about 50 down to 47. Right now, around the world, a decline of 3 on average is actually pretty sizable. For forced labor, things have gotten much worse, right? We're down from, about 60 to about 40. That's a huge decline, which means that we are seeing a rise in forced labor and child labor, which we think of as the worst forms of human rights violations. They often occur in the informal economy, in the shadow economy. In terms of minimum wage, safe working conditions, and work hours, we see, maybe a moderate decline. And in human trafficking, we saw a huge decline, and maybe things are getting better today. So if we're thinking about whether worker rights are improving or declining, part of the answer is it depends on which rights we're interested in. But for the worst forms of worker rights violations, things are getting much worse, and that should worry us. So one question is, why have things gotten worse for a lot of worker rights? One answer is companies are a lot stronger today than they were in the past. Particularly in the developing world, if a company decides to pull out, they can essentially cause an economy to crash. So if a government is trying to hold a firm accountable for labor rights violations, oftentimes they're unable to do so in domestic courts. And they actually have to send people to the United States and try and punish them there or send them over to Europe. Corporations also now have a much greater ability to choose where they set up shop. because there are global supply chains, they can move part of their production to a country with much lower labor protections. And they can mitigate some of their risk by subcontracting out to companies so that they are not liable. Second, we have economic development strategies that have been pursued really since the 1970s, but really started taking off since the 1980s. The IMF and World Bank have often pushed for economic reform during times of crisis, which prioritize business-driven recovery, often at the expense of social welfare spending and worker rights, right? Argument being, we need to jumpstart businesses for the economy to grow and everyone will benefit. So workers need to take sort of a temporary cut in what they have, but in the long run, they'll be better off. And we are now in the long run. And around the world, it does not seem like workers are better off. We also have these new forms of employment, employer-employee relations, zero-hour contracts where you are obligated to work for a company if they call upon you, but they won't give you your hours until the day they need you. So this can make it really hard, particularly in countries like the UK, if you need to earn an income and your wages are just up in the air from week to week. It's really hard to plan. The gig economy as well. You know, a lot of workers have felt empowered working for Uber or Lyft, right? You can earn extra income. But the downside is you don't have any of these worker rights protections in law. And we're starting to see the trade-off between an attempt to escape paid employment, which often has pretty bad working conditions, discrimination, labor rights violations, by moving into the gig economy and some of these alternative working arrangements. And what that has essentially led to is people working multiple jobs, right? Trying to earn a living. Finally, the human rights regime itself tends to prioritize civil and political rights. We're thinking about what shows up in the news. Genocide and killings and torture is a much more headline-grabbing set of rights violations than people on strike that are getting pressured or a company that is trying to union bust. The US in particular, which historically has propped up the human rights movement around the world and championed a lot of human rights, has really rejected a lot of the economic rights and worker rights. And part of this comes out of legacies of the Cold War. So why does this matter, right? Worker rights are declining. Why should we care? Well, one argument is that the decline of worker rights can be tied to growing inequality around the world. In the UN, among scholars, among people who fight for equality, we are really seeing inequality sort of accelerate at a pace where it's hard to imagine how much worse it can get. We're also seeing a disappearance of the middle class, right? So middle class, which tends to be a hallmark of democracy in political science, if they disappear, that's another pillar of democracy disappearing. And so tied to this inequality and decline of the middle class, we're also seeing a lot of democratic backsliding. And one of the things that we know from the literature prevents democratic backsliding and leads to a strong and healthy democracy is strong labor unions who can exert political power, who can negotiate with political parties for policies that benefit workers, but also labor protests as a means of checking both firm violations and government violations. We're seeing increased immigration, in part because if labor rights are violated in your country and you can't earn enough to provide for your family and transportation costs have gone down, you leave your country in search of another where you can earn enough to send remittances back to your family or bring your whole family over. And so the rise in anti-immigrant sentiment and xenophobia in part can be tied to this decline of labor rights. Now, from a policy standpoint, if you really think immigration is a problem, improving worker rights is a really good way to stem the tide of immigration. And so worker rights don't necessarily have to be a left-right issue. Finally, discrimination against vulnerable groups. Worker rights in particular benefit groups that would otherwise be discriminated against in society. They are protections that apply to all workers. So rather than an individual worker having to prove that their employer discriminated them based on gender or race or disability and health status, they have these protections in law and they have legal remedy. Once these things disappear and there is increased competition for good jobs and good wages, these tend to go to the groups and societies that are privileged. And this creates increasing conflict at the domestic level between different ethnic groups, between citizens and non-citizens. So in the US context, even though we haven't always been the biggest champion of worker rights, we do have a history that we can point to and say, at some point, the US thought that this was very important. President FDR called for a second Bill of Rights, and he outlined all of these things. And one of the arguments he made was that this was necessary to protect US security around the world. That during the Cold War, one of the best ways that the US could fight communism was by providing enough for their citizens so that they had a good job, they had food and housing, essentially take away some of the things that the USSR was naming and shaming the US for, and to make that ideology less attractive. And so this becomes one attempt at incorporating economic and worker rights into the US Bill of Rights. It fails. And in part it fails because, well, some really interesting questions about presidential overreach. But since then, the US hasn't ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And even though the ILO has 189 conventions, we've only ratified 14. We have not ratified the ILO convention that I showed at the beginning, which is one of the main conventions that the ILO has put forward and most countries have ratified. And so what does this mean? Well, in the comparative political economy literature, we know that labor unions lead to higher wages for union workers. We also know that they lead to higher wages for non-union workers. So in the US, for example, union workers make about 18% more than non-union workers. And that translates to about $10,000 a year. But unions also improve working conditions for non-union workers. If you threaten to unionize in your job, one of the most common responses from employers is to improve wages a little bit, improve benefits a little bit. So you don't need a union. Look, we're a good employer, we want to keep you, we care about this. And so the threat of unions can also improve working conditions. Unions have also historically, and particularly in the US, won rights for all workers. So the 8-hour workday comes from unions. Overtime pay comes from unions. Safe working conditions comes from unions. The minimum wage in particular is something that unions often push for, because union contracts are sometimes tied to a multiple of the minimum wage. So if they can raise the minimum wage, automatically improves the wages for their workers. So, unions are not just about helping their workers. They both provide selective incentives for their members, but they also do a lot of things that are good for workers in general. Now, this is not to say that unions don't come with problems, right? In the US, particularly, unions were tied to organized crime. Sometimes we have union leaders who advocate for policies that benefit them rather than workers. We can have infighting in unions. But the question is not whether there are problems with unions. It's not even with the question of whether unions don't work. The real question we have to ask is, would workers be better off if you got rid of a union? Time and time again, we find that even with all of these problems, workers are much better off in a union than not. And when we have a strong and well-functioning union, they are much, much better off. So in political science, I tend to think of this as a bargaining game, right? If it is just you versus your employer, you are at a huge disadvantage. If you don't know what other people make, if you can be fired and there's nothing you can do, you have very little power in your job. If you have a union that can negotiate for you, all of a sudden, a lot of things that might negatively affect your job, you don't even have to worry about. You have someone else who can advocate for you. You have strength in numbers. You have knowledge about what everyone makes. So you have more information. You have more power because there are more people organizing and pushing employers to give up a little bit of profits in exchange for better wages and benefits. And you tend to have better job security. If you get fired, the union can advocate on your behalf. So, two of the most violated human rights, if we take the full set of rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, are the right to unionize and the right to strike. That if we look at which rights have improved the most around the world since the UDHR came into force, it would likely be women's political rights are much better today than they were in the past. But a lot of worker rights are violated all around the country. So these are graphs looking at the average level of respect in the 21st century. So this is from 2000 to 2019. And one of the things we find is that there are very few countries that have strong protections for the right to unionize and the right to strike. Very few countries. Most of these are concentrated in Western Europe and the Nordic countries. But we also have massive violations of these rights. And we have a lot of attacks on labor unions, attacks on workers. And these violations are not just tied to you're fired for unionizing. Again, we're seeing a lot of the violence against labor organizing that we see in the US. In the US, labor union membership has fallen. We are at a historic low. In the private sector, 6% of workers are unionized. In the public sector, it's 33%. And most of the unionization in the public sector is among teachers, among police, among firefighters. It's concentrated in particular sectors. The highest union membership, we have New York and Hawaii, but union rates are all over the place in the US. I think the low is South Carolina at 2% of workers. And so we have huge variation in what labor organizing looks like within the US, even as the US has lower union rates than basically every developed country in the world. This has led to declining wages, declining good jobs, less job security, bad working conditions, and most recently, a huge rise in mental health issues related to work. Particularly since the pandemic and the shift now to all meetings can happen on Zoom at all times and you get no break in between meetings. So the amount that we can buy today, the median household in the US, our purchasing power is the same as it was 40 years ago. And this is as the US has production has massively increased. So even though technology has gotten better, we have far more wealth within the country than we did 40 years ago. Workers are not better off. One of the ways that this manifests is child labor. And child labor in the US has always been a problem. We kind of have a spotlight on it now. So I want to focus a little bit on child labor, in part because in those graphs looking at trends in labor rights around the world, child labor is one of the rights that is significantly declining. So I want to be clear what we mean about child labor. Most children around the world perform some child labor. You mow your lawn for pocket money. You do chores around the house. A lot of people support child labor, right? Going to school is work, right? So education is labor. Getting a job before you turn 18 is not necessarily a bad thing, right? So when we're talking about child labor, what we're really talking about is the worst forms of child labor. or child labor that interferes with education and physical mental well-being, right? So we want to distinguish between different types of child labor. In the US, we've recently had sort of a spotlight on these worst forms of child labor. So in February of this year, the US Department of Labor fined Packers Sanitation Services $1.5 million for hiring 13 to 17-year-olds in hazardous jobs. The New York Times investigation then came out and found that, well, this is actually happening in every industry in America, both under the table small businesses, but also large multinational corporations who can afford to pay a decent wage. One of the things that we tend to point to in the US for eliminating child labor is the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. And one of the really notable and important parts of this act is that it excluded agriculture. And so child labor in agriculture has always been a problem. If you just Google US child labor agriculture, every few years, NGOs or newspapers put out a report of tobacco farmers being children. So this is not a new phenomenon. It is one that is getting a lot of attention now. And so one of the questions we should ask is not why is there child labor in the US, but why do we all of a sudden care? So we define child labor using a bunch of ILO conventions and recommendations. But here are sort of the main takeaways. You should not have any children under the age of 14 employed in a private or public sector job for wages. And this is based on international law, right? So most countries around the world have agreed that these are sort of the barriers to entry into the labor force we should respect. No one under 18 should be working on a ship or in a nighttime occupation. No jobs dangerous to life, health, or morals. Children should be found healthy in a physical examination before they're allowed to work. You shouldn't be allowed to work during school hours, right? Work shouldn't interfere with school. No child soldiers or commercial sexual exploitation. And if there are violations, there must be an effective legal remedy, right? So the government fining a company that engages in child labor, we would consider a legal remedy. The question we might ask is that enough money to deter them, to actually punish them for what they've done? And so what we're really looking for is whether work is harmful to children. And we say, there are some forms of work that don't harm children, working for your family. We tend to assume parents care enough about their children not to send them into dangerous situations. And so again, we're really interested in the type of work that is harmful to children. Children's rights in the 21st century, again, don't look great. There are very few countries that respect children's rights on average in the past 20 years. And there are fewer countries that respect children's rights than respected the right to strike or bargain collectively. So one question is, how does the US measure up here? In September of 2022, Human Rights Watch put out a report on children's rights in the US. And one of the things it found is that we do terribly on all children's rights. You could get an A, B, C, D, F. Kind of looks like your grade in a class. And no US state got higher than a C. No state is compliant on minimum age in agriculture or hazardous work, which shouldn't surprise us because that's an industry that was excluded from labor regulations. Missouri gets an F, Florida gets a D, and the best score is New Jersey. There are 18 countries that get a lower score than Missouri, and some of the takeaways from the report, child farm workers as young as 7 are employed in the US. Child marriage is legal in 43 states, and until 2018 was legal in all states. Only 2 states have prohibited corporal punishment in public and private schools. And in the US, more than 30,000 children are referred to juvenile court annually. And I think we are probably the only country, I'm going to say probably, that sentences children to life in prison without parole. And one of the points here is we should care about worker rights because in general, when we see worker rights violated, we see all of these other rights violated. If I know child labor is occurring in a country, I'm pretty sure that they don't have these other rights as well, because a lot of these violations go hand in hand. So one question is, how do we prevent child labor? The literature finds that one of the best ways to prevent child labor is to strengthen unions. Historically and globally, one of the strongest actors in eliminating child labor has been labor unions, who organize in part because children compete with adult workers for wages, but also in part because a lot of the children are coming from families that might otherwise be able to enter the workforce in a union and not need to send their kids into the labor force to earn income. In general, child labor is a really strange human right. For almost every other human right, when it's violated, the people whose rights are violated tend not to be happy about it. The government is killing people, they don't want to get killed. For child labor, that's different. Most families who send their kid into the labor force do so out of necessity. The choice between not being able to feed your family or losing your house or not being able to pay medical bills and sending your kid into the labor force is one that people walk into willingly as a survival strategy. And so we really need to take away the incentives that push children into the labor force rather than focusing on the punishments, right? Improve worker rights so that a family that can, someone who goes into the labor force can support their entire family. Their kids don't need to go. Reduce poverty and inequality, which again, if you improve worker rights, will decline. Strengthen the social safety net. Improvements in the healthcare system are actually one of the best ways to reduce child labor. In the US, if you get sick and it's not covered by healthcare, that's the #1 cause of bankruptcy. And it often forces family to send children into the labor force to help cover the cost of healthcare. One of the worst things you can do is outlaw child labor. What we repeatedly find is that you say, all right, child labor is illegal. Anyone who hires a child gets fined a ton of money. And what you actually end up doing is you're not resolving the problem. And so children end up in far more exploitive conditions. They end up in prostitution, they end up in sweatshops, they end up in situations where they tend to be worse off. And they end up in situations where it is harder to find them. This is particularly true in rural parts of a country. So I will say it is not all bad, right? Particularly since COVID, there is some upside. In the US, we are seeing a revival in labor organizing. We're seeing a rise in support for labor unions. We saw a successful campaign to unionize an Amazon factory with the idea that maybe we can learn from those strategies. And if you can force a company like Amazon or Walmart to unionize the entirety of its labor force, that will have a huge impact on improving working conditions in the country. Human Rights Watch reports and the New York Times investigation, while they may show up time and time again, they shine a spotlight on that. And right now we are in a period where elected officials and citizens are paying attention. And so by repeatedly bringing up these violations, eventually you can reach a time where maybe there is action and maybe there is momentum to change things. Human rights scholars, activists, NGOs continue to document, identify, name and shame the companies that do this and to push for policies that might reduce child labor. We know a lot more today about what it takes to reduce child labor than we did in the past. And because we have better measures of this, I will say child labor is notoriously difficult to identify, but we can generally tell whether it's getting worse or better. Maybe not the scope, but we can look at which interventions work, which ones don't. So thank you for coming. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at skipmark@uri.edu, or you can check out the C-Rights website and learn a little bit more about some of the data.
We'll open it up for question and answers. So I'll let Skip field there if you've got questions or ideas that you want to find.
I was going to ask in one of the slides, it said that middle class is defined. What would be like the worst case scenario in the middle class fell apart? Because that got me thinking only the rich and the poor, and that would be a very domino world. Like,
Yeah, so, I tend to think I'm a little pessimistic, right? If we think of the things that prevent governments from violating your rights, one of them is you're paying attention. You have the time and resources to protest, to run for office, to call and hound them, to punish them if they try and implement laws that are bad for you or your community. The smaller the middle class is, the fewer people who are paying attention. And so you essentially lose an accountability mechanism. So, we are sort of seeing workers condensed and moving slowly down to the bottom. And I think that you lose democracy, you lose accountability. In the worst case scenario, you end up in a situation where you just have very little choice but to work in whatever conditions you're given. And if the goal of human rights is to promote human dignity, this is really the death of human dignity.
Along that same question, there's an argument in aspects of computing labor that terminal involved in this century has a plan between the working class and the owner class. Because the middle class is more likely to align with the upper class with the lower class, which is a wedge. And since it become common, something in the vocabulary, it's been sliding out ever since. The argument to go back to just what the way we talked in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the lower class women just abandon the middle class because it's just another way of trying to divide the workers, and the more it gets divided, the more there's a wall. How do you do that of determining the class that
So I agree. One of the really interesting things in the US is if you ask people what class they are, there's a disproportionate people who they're all middle class, right? We're all middle class. And so the concept middle class is really vague. Like, what are we actually talking the middle of the income distribution? No, right? It has sort of come to incorporate both social hierarchy, education, wages. And, I think we are starting to see a recognition that this is not useful. So if you think of the slogan of the Occupy Wall Street movement, right? 99% versus the 1%. It really is an attempt to reframe this as labor versus capital. And one of the reasons I like to define worker as anyone whose wages do not come from the ownership of land or the wages of other workers is because most of us are going to work for a wage. Most of us are not going to have enough money to have a mansion, right? And I think that class consciousness is really important for negotiating. Maybe everyone should be middle class, right? Like what we actually think of middle class should be the floor. But yeah, I agree with you. I think that any attempt to get all workers to organize together is going to be met with some strategy to try and divide people, whether that is based on class, race, nationality. And so part of the goal of people who are organizing for workers' rights is to cut through that. So I think immigration is the perfect example here, right? Are labor unions pro-immigration? And the answer is it depends, right? If your argument is all workers should be unionized across borders, and we should now be trying to organize transnational labor unions, particularly in multinational corporations which operate in multiple countries, you should be pro-immigration. But if your job is, if you see the job of labor unions to protect the rights of workers in the country, you see labor unions sometimes come out against immigration. And part of this is, again, that distinction. Are we organizing for all workers all around the world? You know, just ideologically, maybe the answer is yes, but then you run up with these pragmatic questions of, well, what can I do now? So, I mean, undocumented immigration is good for firms in the US. We have a lot of examples of companies sort of driving buses down to Mexico and offering people jobs because, while also coming out against immigration, right? Because migrant workers don't have worker rights. They can't draw on the social safety net. And a lot of the violations of child labor are migrant children, right? Who they can't complain if they're in horrible working conditions.
You kind of alluded to it already with FDR policy, but could you explain more why the end of the Cold War has led to more paranoia about discussing workers' rights and labor rights rather than citizens?
Sure. So first I'll talk globally, and then I'll talk within the US. During the Cold War, if you were a developing country, particularly one of the many countries that was newly independent after World War II, a lot of the UK and other countries sort of had independence movements. They were wrecked by war and they couldn't hold on to them. These new governments had to make a decision. Do you want to be a capitalist country or a communist country? And the US was competing with the USSR in an ideological battle. And if you reject worker rights and economic rights, you lose that battle, right? You can't just say, you get the right to vote and criticize your government, but you can't feed your children. Once the USSR is gone, there's no need to placate that ideology. There's no need to essentially handcuff businesses. You shift to a model where development is business driven because you don't have any competition ideologically. So I think part of this is, we see a shift in ideology. I think in the US, we had both the FDR politicians who were arguing we need to provide these things to compete with the USSR, but we also had the Red Scare and McCarthyism. And in the US, we had a lot of people who were arguing for leftist ideologies, who were essentially arrested, lost their job, imprisoned, exported from the US. And that ideology also died. Now, whether you think communism or socialism is good or bad is really beside the point. I think the important part is those ideas were no longer allowed to be spoken, right? They're not taught. So in the US, we've seen strikes by economics PhD students who say, why aren't we learning theories about Marxism that they teach in Europe? Right? Whether we agree or not, we should know what the landscape is, what the options are. And so I think because in the US, when we say, what should working conditions look like? We're thinking about the US context rather than a broader global context or a context of what has been possible historically.
Okay, on the Bill of Rights, on human rights, that Eleanor Roosevelt championed that, and included, like you said, the union rights and voting rights. Are we not one of the countries that never ratified it?
Well, we've signed the UDHR,
Okay.
but it's not legally binding. It's essentially saying, I think everyone should have democracy. But that doesn't.
Why are we
folks that, in the country that we are, we never stepped up to the plate by the others.
Well, the ICSCR was championed by the Soviet Union. The Mirror Covenant is the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which was essentially the US Bill of Rights. And so because we were in a rivalry with the USSR, we essentially said, these are not the rights you should focus on. In the US, it became a really interesting debate about whether these actually are rights. So there's a legal argument that all rights should be something you could take to a court of law, right? If you have a right, that means someone has a duty to provide you with that right. And for things like the right to work or the right to food, it becomes a little bit unclear who that is. And so the US said, well, we really should focus only on the rights that we can build into a legal regime. Whereas the USSR and really since the end of the Cold War, countries like China have argued, actually, we should provide healthcare and education and jobs and reduce inequality. And well, we should also be allowed to kind of imprison anyone who criticizes us. That's more important to provide people with economic rights and worker rights than to provide them with civil and political rights. Every time I teach human rights, I sort of ask my students, which would you rather have? Would you rather live in a democracy free to criticize your government with a free speech, free press? But like you have no worker rights, you are really poor, you have no water, food, housing. Or would you rather live in a country where all of your economic rights are taken care of, but if you criticize the government, you're going to be killed and thrown in prison? And 10 years ago, I'd say it was 80 to 90% on the US side, right? We want freedom and democracy. Today, it's about 50-50. And I think that shift represents a growing recognition that something is wrong and that something is broken and that you go to college and maybe you are worse off than your parents were, even though you are better educated.
Okay, I know you went on the sickness and how many times, and I was wondering, do they have that type of they goals, like the working poor? You have so many working poor in the United States. You have companies that have goals of around hiring, pulls out employees to give them benefits or give them paid vacation, just keep them part-time. And it's like, in my opinion, these big companies like Walmart, you know, Starbucks, they found loopholes to kind of keep it along where they're doing enough, but not doing anything. And even with some state departments, like I have a friend that is a caseworker, she gets paid 50 cents above the living wage to not qualify for any type of state assistance. 50 cents, that's her monthly, 50 cents above the line. So she's considered a working poor and she works for them. So my question is, what can be done to eliminate those loopholes to make it a fair playing field for all?
Well, you know, I wish I had I wish I had the solution. I'll give you some thoughts though. The US State Department's unofficial position prior to President Trump was that we will not ratify any human rights treaty that requires us to alter domestic human rights law, right? So every single country in the world has ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, except the US. There is no other treaty. It is the most popular human rights treaty in the world, and the US is the lonely excluded from that. In part because we think it would interfere with your right to deal with your own children, interfere with the rights of the family, and it would require us to change domestic law. In recent years, that has become sort of the official policy. And so if we don't do it domestically, we shouldn't have to pay attention to what is being done internationally. That's really scary, right? It is a a retreat from cosmopolitanism and working and cooperating with other countries to saying the US way is the only way. Never a good look for a democracy. In terms of how do you stop firms from finding new loopholes? I like to think of it as a never-ending battle. If you create a law that prevents firms from violating one type of right, they will come up with a way to violate another one. And so then you need a new law, and they will come up with a way to violate that too. That you can never actually rest. From a citizen standpoint, one of the things you can do is, well, push for a union drive at your job, call out labor rights violations, support labor unions when they are on strike at a supermarket. Don't cross the picket line. You know, I really think that while there are a lot of policies that could work, right? You could vote for politicians who make worker rights a part of their campaign and donate your time or your resources to that. If you are a little pessimistic about elected officials' ability to solve these problems, I really think protest and labor organizing are the best chance we have at improving worker rights. And while it can seem really dire now, you know, for most of human history, labor organizing was illegal. We are actually in a much stronger position today than we were even 100 years ago. And so while we might be on the decline now, that doesn't mean that we will always be on the decline, especially if people continue to recognize that there's a problem and push for an improvement and a demand that their elected officials respect these rights. You can also, you know, work with campaigns like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and push for other governments to pressure the US. The US does care about its international reputation. And so if we get named and shamed for doing atrocious things around the world, elected officials care. And then if they try and, you know, push for a policy that won't actually fix anything, call them out for it. And now you have the world's attention, and maybe you get reform. And if you have a victory, you build on that. You start an organization and you inform and you push for more change.
So being subnational, state by state variation. So clearly, some of the governments that responded to some of these pressures at some point in time. And it's just a matter of getting more state governments.
Yeah, and paying attention to what happened in those states, right? What strategies did they use to win? Which US labor organizations were successful? You know, if you're in a job and you're not unionized and working conditions are poor, you can contact a labor union that represents your sector of the economy. And often they will send someone to talk to you about organizing a union drive and to prepare for it. And it is really difficult and it often fails. But, you know, working with someone who's done this before can increase the probability that it works.
I was just gonna say, more of us than them. But so organizing work. You have to stand together with the other organizing. So there's that.
Yeah. Yeah, we have far more power as citizens than those who are elected to office. So as long as we are all on the same page, you can push your government to respect all human rights.
I've seen a lot, like, unions are becoming more of a popular thing. Right? They're becoming more of a hit thing now. And places like Starbucks, who have been using, even locally here, the ones that are organizing here, they have been notorious for their tactics in fighting with efforts with their employees, firing them for union organizing. They have been sanctioned by the National Labor Relations Board on several occasions for their tactics. But they're still doing them. Right. How do we fix that? you know, in order for the protection that we're supposed to have with the right ordinance in our United States of America, we have nothing that backs it up.
You know, I think one of the best thing, did you want to add?
I'm just gonna say, can you mention earlier? It's only been just under 100 years that the legal right. Order. Before that, people fought. Unions to try to improve their ability by public education to the kids did not go to mine. At one time, the mine owners groomed young children into the mine going to the chapel. They didn't listen. So they carried the public to the viewpoint. So it's the art of justice that must be the king. Not everyone needs to care. The art of justice moves slowly, but it is moving. But what we can do is keep being vocal, keep being holding the power of brokenness. Stand in solidarity.
I think
And then just is phrase of the international workers.
The teachers in Chicago are an example of that. They not only have the support of their fellow teachers, but they also wanted the support of the community.
Oh, they just stayed last couple of years building.
yeah, you know, I agree with all of that, right? I think part of this is recognizing there are no easy solutions that are going to fix this overnight, right? Part of this is you have to do this every day, right? You have to, one, learn what strategies work and build alliances with those who've done this before and try and build alliances with those whose interests would be better aligned with yours. You have to educate both the other workers and the community and the broader country about what is happening, what these violations actually look like. You have to both tell sort of anecdotal stories that tug at the heartstrings while also presenting data and statistics and a set of demands that can be met. And you have to do this day after day after day, and you will fail again and again and again until you don't. And once you win, you learn why you won. And others emulate that, and then they start winning using that strategy. And so this really is, you know, a long-term process. And we can often get really discouraged because we're looking at what's happening in 5, 10 years. But we are better off today than we were 100 years ago. And we know a lot more today than we did 100 years ago. Part of the reason we're in decline is firms are organizing across the world, and we haven't quite figured out how to organize across borders. And I think that is probably the best strategy. And we have examples of workers for the same hotel chain, for the same company like Amazon, organizing strikes in multiple countries. And I think that's probably the best strategy moving forward. Do you have a...
For your worldwide measures, say, this is part of the State Department reports. How accurate are those? Will they continue to be accurate?
So they're certainly biased, right? I will be the first to say, I think all data has bias. The question is, do we know what that bias looks like? And can we mitigate against it? So a really good paper by Chad Clay, who spoke here a little bit ago, investigated sort of the content of reports and how they changed under different administrations. For a lot of the rights we're looking at here, so this is 25 different human rights, they're fairly reliable. there's, some increasing bias or decreasing bias over time. I think the big exception to that was under the Trump administration, that there were actually noticeable changes in the report, particularly related to women, abortion, LGBTQ rights. So I think, one of the things we should do is not trust any one set of data, right? But if the C Rights and the Human Rights Measurement Initiative and the Subnational Analysis of Repression Project and the UN and activists in a country are all pointing out that there are problems, we can be more reliable. We can be more sure that those data are reliable. So we should check as many different sources as we can. And, if you see my data and things look really bad, and you see a different data set and things look really good, one of the things is to try and investigate, why do we see that gap? Is it about reporting, or is it about some strategies of repression are more successful at avoiding this type of documentation versus that? So I think where we see differences is actually an opportunity to learn, build theory, and understand how the violation of rights is evolving over time. But luckily, we do have a pretty large literature examining the bias. So if you do empirical modeling, you can control for some of this.
You brought up the farm workers being excluded from minimum wage and your analysis of children working in the farm industry, which is very interesting. I thought about on that context. Is that also the have indicators, of children working excessively or in food and beverage or domestic, which are also excluded from minimum wage? Does that track in that
So the lack of labor rights protections for children is mainly in the agricultural sector. So in other sectors, children should have the same rights. And depending on the state, there are usually regulations, for example, on how many hours a child can work, at what hours, in what industries. Food and beverage kind of gets around this. If you're a waiter, they say as long as your tips average out to the minimum wage, we don't have to pay you more. In practice, what that often ends up meaning is you don't get paid the minimum wage.
And seeing, do you think that honesty that's kind of rolled out of child labor? One of the states is do you think this would be something that other stations can follow?
I mean, I think that it is a real risk, right? So when when we passed legislation to outlaw child labor, there was a massive campaign by the mining sector, by manufacturing. They would put out all these videos of kids saying like, I love to work and I'm so happy. And that is, the logic is, well, if kids need to work in order to feed their family, who are we to stop them, right? We should let them develop human capital now while they can. And one of the things we have to recognize is what might be good for the individual might be bad for the community, right? That if you really want to stop child labor, it's not just about child labor. It's also about ensuring that the rest of the workforce has better rights. So I think one of the things we can really do better is instead of focusing on the issue of child labor, we focus on the full set of worker rights and see this as one symptom of a broader problem. And here is how it manifests. And it manifests over here with prison labor that is underpaid and arguably forced labor or penal labor, right? And it manifests over here with undocumented migrants who have no rights and really don't have any choice. And seeing all of this is kind of connected. You improve child labor by improving all of these other rights. And really saying everyone in the US should be guaranteed a basic minimum standard of living, right? That's what international human rights say. Everyone gets a house, food, shelter, the right to work if they can't work, unemployment, social security. You don't have to earn this, right? You shouldn't have to be a US citizen. Everyone has this right. And it shouldn't be taken away. I think we have a long way to go before we get there, but I don't think it's impossible to get there.
Goal. All right, we'll stop there. Thank you all for being here, and Skip, thank you for making the trip and being here also. Yeah, if we're ready to hang out, we're going back on the way out, we have to work with that out. Thanks.
Thank you for having me.
Great, perfect, yeah.